The man who was expelled for thinking. Too much to understand what Spinoza discovered about Muhammad, you first need to comprehend where Spinoza came from, not just geographically, from Amsterdam, from a family of Sephardic Jews who fled the Iberian Inquisition, but existentially. You need to understand what it means to be a man who thinks with such freedom that his own community decides it is safer and cleaner for him to simply cease to exist within it. It was the summer of 1656. Amsterdam was bustling with trade, ideas, and the mix of cultures that made the city the most cosmopolitan in Europe. The Dutch Republic was, compared to the rest of the continent still bloodied by religious wars, an extraordinary experiment in relative tolerance. Jews could live there, have synagogues, pursue professions, prosper, as long as they did not disturb the civil peace. The Sephardic Jewish community of Amsterdam was largely composed of descendants of Jews who, decades earlier, in the Iberian Peninsula, had been forced to convert to Catholicism, the so-called conversos or Marranos, and who, upon arriving in Holland, openly resumed their Jewish faith. It was a community marked by the trauma of forced conversion, by the memory of persecution, by the need to prove to the Dutch world that they were respectable Jews and not disruptors of order. Within this fragile and watchful community, Baruch Spinoza, son of a reasonably prosperous merchant, brilliant student of the city's yeshivot, a young man of only 23 years, had begun to think. And thinking, he would discover, was the most subversive act possible. On July 27, 1656, the leadership of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam issued against Spinoza the most violent, absolute, and mysterious cherem in the entire history of Dutch Judaism. The document, written in Portuguese, the language of the community, declared that Spinoza had committed heinous abominations and enormous evils that he practiced and taught, without ever specifying what those abominations were. Without a formal trial, without the possibility of public defense, without indication of appeal. The curses contained in the document were of a disturbing spiritual violence. May God curse him by day and by night. May God curse him when he lies down and when he rises. May God never forgive him. May God unleash all his wrath and fury against this man. May all the curses written in the book of law be cast upon him. May his name be erased from this world and the world to come. May no one communicate with him in writing. May no one do him any favor. May no one remain within 4 cubits of his proximity. Read this again, and let the weight of the words settle. They were asking God to destroy a 23-year-old young man. For thinking. What had he thought? Historians still debate today because the document does not say, but the clues are in the work he would produce in the following years. He had likely expressed in conversations, and perhaps in private writings, some of the ideas that later exploded in the theological political treatise, that the Bible was not the direct word of God, but a set of texts written by human beings in different times, reflecting the limitations and interests of their authors. That God was not the personal being of religious tradition, but the infinite substance of all reality. That the soul was not immortal in the traditional theological sense. That the Mosaic law was a political legislation for a specific people at a specific time, not an eternal and universal moral code. These ideas were, for the Jewish community of Amsterdam in the mid-17th century, existentially threatening, not only as religious heterodoxy, but as a political risk. A community of refugees living under Dutch tolerance could not afford to harbor a free thinker who questioned the foundations of the Jewish faith, and who, by doing so, provided ammunition to those who wanted to expel the Jews from the Netherlands. The cherem against Spinoza was, in part, an act of community self-defense. Spinoza was expelled, and then something happened that no one expected. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not humble himself. He did not back down. He did not beg to be welcomed back into the fold of the community that was literally his only family, his only social world, the only place where he had identity. He simply left. He exchanged his Hebrew name Baruch, which means blessed, for the Latin equivalent Benedictus. He learned the craft of polishing optical lenses, which provided him with enough income for an austere and independent life. He lived in rented rooms in Rijnsburg, Voorburg, and finally The Hague. He refused a chair that Heidelberg University offered him, because, he replied, teaching in public would require him to moderate his freedom of expression, and his freedom of expression was the only thing he was not willing to moderate. He lived this way for 21 years after his excommunication, in productive silence, in voluntary poverty, in the company of a few selected friends who formed a kind of clandestine intellectual circle around him. He exchanged letters with the greatest thinkers in Europe. He wrote with a density and precision that had no parallel in the philosophy of his time. And in 1670, he anonymously published, because he knew exactly what he was doing, the Theological Political Treatise. The book that a contemporary Dutch pastor called a work forged in hell by the devil himself, and that an ecclesiastical decree the following year described as full of abominations. What was in this book that caused such horror? The simplest answer is everything. Everything that the Abrahamic religions needed to be true, Spinoza systematically demonstrated to be false. Or, more precisely, he demonstrated to be humanly produced, culturally conditioned, historically situated, politically motivated. The Bible was not the Word of God. It was a collection of human texts. Moses did not write the Pentateuch. This was impossible to demonstrate philologically, and Spinoza demonstrated it. The prophets did not hear the voice of God. They had extraordinarily powerful imaginations that produced visions and experiences they interpreted as divine, but which were, in essence, psychological phenomena. Miracles were not supernatural interventions. They were misunderstood natural events or allegorical narratives interpreted literally by posterity without historical sense. And God. God himself was not the personal, transcendent being who speaks, who orders, who intervenes, who loves, who punishes. The God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Allah of Islam, the Father of the New Testament. He was something radically different, the infinite and necessary substance of all reality, the totality of being. That which exists absolutely necessarily, and of which everything that exists is an expression or modification. God did not create the world. God was the world. God did not have a will separate from the laws of nature. God was the laws of nature. God could not act differently than he acts. Just as 2 plus 2 cannot fail to be 4, the nature of God is pure, absolute necessity, without alternative. This is the philosophy we will apply throughout this video to Islam, to the figure of Muhammad, to the Quran, to the doctrine of Islamic revelation, and the result of this application is what no channel has the courage to say out loud. But before we get there, we need to understand the instrument that Spinoza gave us. We need to understand his theory of prophecy, because it is what makes everything collapse, the theory that demonstrates with the precision of a surgeon and the courage of a martyr why no human being has ever heard the voice of God, why every claim of divine revelation is at its core a claim about human psychology, and why Muhammad, as much as Islam needs him to be the infallible channel of Allah's eternal word, was philosophically just a man, an extraordinary man, but just a man. And this distinction between messenger of God and extraordinary human being changes everything, absolutely everything. The theory of prophecy, the philosophical bomb that Islam cannot disarm. In the first chapter of the Theological Political Treatise, Spinoza formulates one of the most explosive questions in the history of Western thought. A question that seems simple on the surface and that hides in its depths a destructive charge capable of demolishing the foundations of any Abrahamic religion that dares to examine it honestly. The question is, what is exactly a prophet? Not what the religious tradition says it is, not what the faithful believe it is, but what is philosophically a human being who claims to have received a direct revelation from God? The answer of the Abrahamic religions is unanimous in its fundamentals, no matter how much they differ in details. A prophet is someone chosen by God to receive and transmit a divine message. The prophet is a vehicle, a channel, a messenger. The message is not his, it is God's. He did not invent it, did not deduce it, did not imagine it. He heard it. He saw it. He received it from a source that completely transcends human capacity for intellectual or creative production. For Islam, this doctrine has a particularly absolute and precise form, Muhammad is the Rasul Allah, the messenger of God, not a philosopher, not a poet, not a brilliant social reformer, a messenger. The very Islamic title of Muhammad defines his function as that of a courier between the infinite creator and finite creatures. The content of what he delivered, the Quran, is therefore not his work. It is the work of God. It is Kalam Allah, the speech of God. Spinoza begins to dismantle this idea in a way that at first glance seems almost respectful. He does not say that the prophets were liars. He does not say they were conscious impostors. He says something much more disturbing, because much harder to refute, that the prophets were human beings with an extraordinarily developed faculty, imagination, and that they confused, in good faith or not, the products of that imagination with messages of divine origin. To understand this argument in all its strength, we need to understand what Spinoza meant by imagination. In the Spinozist philosophical system, there are fundamentally two modes of knowledge that interest us here: imaginative knowledge and rational knowledge. Imaginative knowledge is the most common. It is what happens when we perceive the world through our senses, when we form opinions based on personal experiences, when we create mental images, when we feel emotions, when we construct narratives to make sense of what happens to us. Imagination is not, in itself, negative. It is the mode by which most human beings navigate most of their lives. But it is intrinsically subjective, limited, and colored by individual personality, culture, historical context, prior experiences, fears and desires of the one imagining. Rational knowledge is different. It is the knowledge we achieve when we understand the true causes of things, not as they appear to us, but as they are, in the necessary relationships they establish with each other. Mathematics, rigorous philosophy, science, when practiced with sufficient rigor, are expressions of rational knowledge. This knowledge is objective, universal, necessary. 2 + 2 is 4 for any human being in any culture, at any time in history. The prophets, Spinoza boldly asserts, were fundamentally beings of imagination, not of reason. They had extraordinarily vivid imaginations, extraordinarily intense emotions, and an extraordinary ability to communicate those emotions and images in a way that moved crowds. But they were not necessarily great philosophers or great scientists, and this has profound consequences. Spinoza notes in the Theological Political Treatise that when he examines the biblical prophets one by one, he notices that they had often primitive worldviews on philosophical and scientific issues, that different prophets received revelations in completely different ways, some through dreams, some through voices, some through symbolic visions, some through ecstatic trance, and that the diversity of these experiences is incompatible with the idea of a uniform and objective divine transmission. If God spoke directly, with all the perfection of an infinite and omniscient being, why would the form of communication vary so much from prophet to prophet? Spinoza's answer is clear: because the form of communication did not depend on God. It depended on the prophet. Each prophet received, or more precisely produced, a religious experience that corresponded to their particular temperament, their particular culture, their particular circumstances. A melancholic prophet saw dark and apocalyptic scenes. A serene prophet had peaceful visions. A 7th century Arab prophet produced revelations in 7th century Arabic. Now apply this to Islam with all the philosophical seriousness that the argument deserves. The Quran is in Arabic, not just in Arabic, but in a specific Arabic, the Arabic of Hijaz, the dialect of Mecca and Medina, from the early 7th century of the Christian era. This linguistic, geographical, and temporal specificity is not accidental. It is the clearest possible human signature on a text that Islamic doctrine wants to present as eternally divine. If the Quran were truly the speech of an infinite, eternal, and universal God, a God who created not only the Arabs of the 7th century, but all human beings of all times and places, why would this God choose to communicate in a specific dialect of a specific region of a specific time? Why not in all languages simultaneously? Why not in a universal logical language understandable by all rational beings in all cultural contexts? The only answer that Islamic theology can offer, that God chose Arabic because Muhammad was Arab, and chose the 7th century because it was the providentially appropriate moment, is, from a Spinozist perspective, an implicit admission of what the doctrine wants to deny, that the revelation was shaped by the human receiver, not just by the divine transmitter. If the form of revelation depends on the prophet, on their language, their time, their culture, then the content of the revelation may also depend. And if the content depends on the prophet is not a neutral channel. They are the co-author of the message, which means that the message is not purely from God, it is to a significant degree from the prophet. Orthodox Islam responds to this argument with the doctrine of the inimitability of the Quran, the Ijaz al-Quran. The Quran is inimitable in its literary and spiritual perfection. No human being could have produced such a sublime text. This inimitability is proof of its divine origin. Spinoza would respond in 2 precise philosophical movements. First, literary inimitability is an aesthetic judgment, not a logical demonstration. The Quran seems inimitable to those raised in the Islamic tradition, for whom the Arabic of the Quran has a religious and emotional resonance inseparable from decades of recitation, prayer, and cultural identity. This is not evidence of divine origin. It is evidence that aesthetically and emotionally powerful texts produce intense subjective experiences in those who repeatedly revive them since childhood. Homer's Iliad is also considered inimitable by those who grew up within the literary tradition it founded. Shakespeare is inimitable. Dante is inimitable. None of them are divine. Second, even if the Quran were objectively inimitable, even if no linguist in the world could identify any other human work of comparable quality, that would prove it was written by a genius of language and religious thought. Not that it was dictated by God. A genius and a prophet are not the same thing. And Spinoza, more than anyone, knew that human geniuses can produce works of depth and beauty that seem to transcend the ordinary, without that transcendence requiring a supernatural explanation. But the Spinozist argument about prophecy has a third, even deeper dimension that goes beyond the question of individual imagination and touches on the philosophical structure of the entire revelatory enterprise. It is the argument about what God can or cannot do. For Spinoza, God, the infinite and necessary substance that is the totality of reality, does not have will in the sense that Abrahamic religions understand. God does not decide to reveal the Quran. God does not choose Muhammad as a messenger. God does not send the angel Gabriel, because all of this would imply that God is a being who weighs alternatives and chooses between them, which would imply that God is limited by possibilities that he could realize, but did not. But God, for Spinoza, is not limited by anything. God is pure infinitude, and infinitude does not weigh alternatives. It has no deliberation. It does not choose. It acts out of necessity of its own nature, necessarily, inevitably, without alternative. Just as the sun does not decide to emit light, it emits out of necessity of its own nature. God does not decide to create, reveal, intervene. Reality is what necessarily is because the nature of God is what necessarily is. In this philosophical framework, the idea that God decided to reveal the Quran to Muhammad is incoherent, not because God is weak or distant, but because God is absolute necessity, and absolute necessity does not decide. It simply is. This is the point where Spinoza's philosophy and Islam become absolutely irreconcilable, not in matters of detail, not in matters of interpretation, not in matters that could be negotiated by flexible theologians, but in matters of fundamental structure of reality. The Allah of Islam is a personal being who speaks. The God of Spinoza is the impersonal necessity that is. These two concepts are not different versions of the same idea. They are contradictory statements about the ultimate nature of reality, and only one can be right. You have come this far. This is not an accident. Most people close the video when philosophy starts to get heavy, but you stayed. So I want to ask you a question now, and I want you to answer in the comments. If Spinoza and Muhammad could meet in a room, what would be the first thing Spinoza would say? Think about it and write. Because the answer you give will say a lot about how you understand what we are discussing. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Not because I am asking, but because videos like this reach those who are subscribed first. And what comes next is deeper, more disturbing and more necessary than everything you just heard. Religion as an instrument of power. What Spinoza understood. That believers do not want to see. There is a dimension of Spinoza's thought on religion that is often softened, if not directly omitted, by the more cautious academic readings of his work. It is the political dimension, and it is this dimension that, when applied to Islam, produces the most disturbing argument of all, not because it is the most technically difficult to refute, but because, once understood, it is impossible to unsee. Spinoza did not see religion merely as a matter of epistemology, of what we can or cannot know about God. He also saw it as a matter of power, of who holds power, how it was obtained, how it is maintained, and at what cost to the freedom and dignity of the governed. In the theological political treatise, he constructs a theory of religion as a social control mechanism, not in the cynical and simplistic terms of a deliberate conspiracy, but in the much more sophisticated and disturbing terms of a structural necessity. Religion, Spinoza observes, serves a function that no other social system can fulfill with equal effectiveness. It transforms voluntary obedience into sacred obedience. I explain what I mean by this. Any complex society needs mechanisms that make its members obey the rules, even when they do not want to, even when they do not understand why, even when obedience is costly to them. Civil laws can be enforced by force, but force is expensive, inefficient, and unstable. A state that maintains order only through the fear of violence is a state that lives permanently on the brink of revolt. What every successful social order needs is something more. It needs the members of society to internalize the rules, to feel them as their moral obligation, to obey not out of fear of punishment, but out of conviction of duty. Religion is the most effective mechanism humanity has discovered to produce this internalization. When the laws of a society are presented not as rules conventionally established by fallible and revisable human beings, but as commandments from God, eternal, absolute, irrevocable, sanctioned not only by earthly punishment, but by eternal consequence, they acquire a completely different motivational force. Do not steal, because the law says you should not steal, is a phrase that a clever thief can always circumvent if he calculates that the risk of being caught is low. Do not steal because God has forbidden it, and will punish you eternally if you do, is a phrase that operates even when there is no police officer nearby, even when the risk of temporal punishment is zero. Because the sanction is no longer merely external, it is internal, it is eternal, it is of the very structure of moral reality. Spinoza observes that the greatest legislators in history were those who understood this, consciously or intuitively. Moses did not give the Hebrew people a civil code. He gave them the Torah, the law of God. Lycurgus, the legislator of Sparta, claimed that his laws were approved by the oracle of Delphi. Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, asserted that he received his laws from the goddess Egeria. The pattern is universal. Great legislators need God, or something functionally equivalent, for their laws to work. And Muhammad followed this pattern with a completeness and effectiveness that no other religious legislator in history matched. Because what Muhammad built in Medina between 622 and 632 AD, the 10 years after the Hijrah, was not just a religious community. It was a state, a complete state with political, military, judicial, fiscal, and diplomatic structure. A state whose laws were simultaneously laws of God, not laws inspired by God, not laws approved by God, but laws that were literally the words of God as conveyed by the prophet. This has a political consequence that Spinoza would have identified as the most striking and dangerous trait of the Islamic project: the total, structural, and intentional fusion between religious authority and political authority. In Muhammad's state in Medina, the will of the political leader and the will of God were, by definition, identical. Questioning Muhammad's decision was questioning Allah. Disobeying the prophet was disobeying God. Criticizing the leader's policy was committing blasphemy. This fusion is not a later distortion of Islam, a perversion introduced by ambitious caliphs or corrupt jurists. It is the original design. It is the structure that Muhammad himself built. which the Quran explicitly sanctions in dozens of verses, and which Orthodox Islamic tradition defends to this day as the ideal model of social organization, the caliphate, the government of God on earth, administered by a representative of the Prophet. Spinoza would ask the question that this structure inevitably suggests: who benefits? When a political leader claims that his decisions are divine revelations, that his enemies are enemies of God, that questioning his authority is sin and apostasy, that the laws he promulgates are eternal and irrevocable by any human process, who benefits from this arrangement? The answer is obvious, and it is not the people. Let us look at what happens in the Medinan Surahs, the revelations that Muhammad received during the years he governed Medina, with open Spinozist eyes. When the Battle of Badr in 624 AD produced a considerable war booty, and the question of how to divide it created tensions in the Muslim community, a revelation came, Surah 8, Al-Anfal, the spoils of war, that resolved the issue. The revelation determined that 1/5 of the spoils belonged to God, the Prophet and the Prophet's family. Those who were dissatisfied with the division were, according to the next verse, questioning Allah and His Messenger. When a group of hypocrites in Medina began to question Muhammad's military policies, a revelation came, in several surahs, identifying them as the worst kind of sinners, promising them divine punishment, and authorizing the Prophet to deal with them harshly. When Muhammad's wives created friction among themselves, and some of them questioned their privileges, a revelation came, Surah 66, explicitly reprimanding them by name and establishing the Prophet's authority over them. When the Jewish tribes of Medina refused to recognize Muhammad as a prophet and entered into conflict with the Muslim community, revelations came, in several surahs, condemning them as a corrupt people who had distorted previous scriptures and that authorized or required severe measures against them. Spinoza would not need more examples to formulate his conclusion. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. Muhammad's revelations came when they were politically necessary, resolved the political problems Muhammad faced at the time, favored the political interests of the Prophet and his close community, and sanctioned with divine authority what would otherwise be merely contestable human decisions. This does not conclusively prove that Muhammad was a conscious impostor. Spinoza would be honest enough to recognize this nuance. The history of religious psychology is full of examples of leaders who genuinely believed in their visions, whose visions were genuinely powerful and transformative, but who were unconsciously shaped by the pressures and needs of their particular situation. Subjective sincerity and human origin are not mutually exclusive. But, and this is the critical point, Muhammad's subjective sincerity does not resolve the philosophical problem. If the revelations were shaped by Muhammad's circumstances, even if unconsciously, even in good faith, then they reflect the limitations, interests, and prejudices of a human being of the 7th century. And a text that reflects the limitations of a human being of the 7th century is not the eternal word of an omniscient God. It is a historical document of immense cultural, spiritual, and literary value. But it is a historical document, not the eternal constitution of all humanity. This distinction between historical value and eternal truth is what Orthodox Islam cannot, under any circumstances, admit, because admitting it is to open the doors for each generation to reinterpret, question, modify, or reject what no longer fits its context. It is to open the doors to unrestricted ijtihad, to legislative democracy, to the separation between religious law and civil law, to everything that political Islam in its most rigorous versions considers an existential threat. And that is why Spinoza's political philosophy, his insistence on the separation between theology and politics, its unrestricted defense of freedom of thought and expression, its argument that no religious authority can have legitimate coercive power over the citizens of a free state, is, in the Islamic context, not only philosophically uncomfortable, it is revolutionary, it is subversive. It is, according to the classical Islamic law of various countries, criminal. God does not speak, the philosophical argument that undermines the Quran. There is a line in Latin that Spinoza wrote in the Ethics, his magnum opus, published posthumously in 1677, that encapsulates in 7 words the most devastating argument ever formulated against any revealed religion. The line is, Deus sive natura, God or nature. Not God and nature, not God above nature, not God as a creator separate from nature, but God or nature, as if the two words were synonymous, interchangeable references to one and the same reality viewed from two different angles. This is the point from which everything begins, and to understand why it philosophically destroys the Islamic doctrine of revelation, we need to comprehend it in all its depth. In Spinoza's system, there is only one substance, a single fundamental, infinite, eternal, necessary reality. Everything that exists is, in some way, part of that one substance or a modification of it. Physical bodies, rocks, planets, stars, human bodies, are modes of the substance as extension. Thoughts, minds, consciousness are modes of the substance as thought. But both are the same substance manifesting in different attributes. This unique substance is what Spinoza calls God. But, and this is the crucial point, this God does not have the characteristics that the Abrahamic religions attribute to him. He has no personality, he has no purpose, he has no will in the sense of deliberation and choice. He has no emotions, does not love, does not hate, does not get angry, does not show compassion. He does not create in the sense of producing something separate from himself, for there is nothing separate from himself. And above all, for what concerns us, he does not speak. He cannot speak. Speaking would imply being a subject communicating with other subjects separate from himself. But there is nothing separate from God. Muhammad, like any human being, is a modification of the divine substance, not a creature separate from God, not an external receiver waiting for a signal from a transcendent source. Muhammad is part of God, just as a wave is part of the ocean, just as thought is part of the mind that thinks it. To say that God sent a message to Muhammad, in the Spinozist context, is as incoherent as saying that the ocean sent a letter to one of its waves. The metaphor of communication presupposes two separate terms, a sender and a recipient, and Spinoza's philosophy eliminates that separation at its root. But the Spinozist critique of Islamic revelation is not only metaphysical, it does not rest solely on this conception of God. It also unfolds into a rigorous epistemological argument, examining how any supposed divine communication could be verified by the one receiving it. Think of Muhammad's situation. He claims to have received a revelation. How would he know that this revelation came from God and not from his own imagination? How would he distinguish between a genuinely divine origin experience and an experience produced by his own unconscious mind? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine philosophical question, and it is a question that the classical Islamic tradition effectively tried to answer. Medieval Islamic theologians developed sophisticated doctrines about the signs that distinguish genuine prophecy from illusion or demonic possession. The true prophet, they said, is recognizable by his exemplary moral character, isma, moral infallibility, by his ability to perform miracles, and by the coherence and beauty of his message. Spinoza would respond to each of these criteria with the same surgical precision he applied to all other theological arguments, the exemplary moral character. Muhammad was, undeniably, a man of great moral presence in many respects. His message of rigorous monotheism, human dignity, equality before God, care for the poor and marginalized, was genuinely revolutionary in the Arab context of the 7th century. But the moral character of the one transmitting a message is not evidence of the divine origin of the message. There are people of exemplary moral character in all religious, philosophical, and secular traditions. Socrates was of exemplary moral character. Buddha was of exemplary moral character. Did that make them prophets of God? Furthermore, Muhammad's character included, according to Islamic sources themselves, aspects that we today, with our moral standards, would find problematic: the number of wives and concubines, the treatment of prisoners of war, the approval of assassinations of critics, military conquest campaigns. The moral evaluation of a historical figure is always complex and contextual. The miracles. We will return to this point in more detail in a later section. For now, it suffices to note that Spinoza considered belief in miracles, in the sense of supernatural interventions that violate natural laws, philosophically impossible. The laws of nature are the expression of God's nature. God cannot violate his own nature. Therefore, miracles as supernatural interventions are philosophically impossible. What we call miracles are misunderstood natural events or literalized allegorical narratives. The coherence and beauty of the message, we have already addressed this. The literary quality of a text is not evidence of its divine origin, and the coherence of the Quran, which Islamic theologians present as proof of its divine origin, given that it was revealed over 22 years in varied circumstances, is significantly less perfect than Islamic apologetics suggest. There are internal contradictions, verses abrogated by other verses, passages that clearly reflect specific and immediate historical contexts, variations in style between the Meccan and Medinan surahs. But there is an even more fundamental argument that Spinoza would raise against the very structure of the Islamic doctrine of revelation. Islam claims that the Quran was revealed as proof of itself. The literary inimitability of the text is its own evidence of divine origin. But this is a circular argument of the most classic kind. I assert that the text is divine. How do you prove that? Because the text is inimitably beautiful. How do you know it is inimitably beautiful? Because it is divine. The circularity is complete and perfect and cannot be broken from within the system. For Spinoza, this type of circular argument was the symptom of a system that had abandoned reason in favor of imagination, that had replaced demonstration with assertion, evidence with authority, argument with reverence. And a system that cannot justify its foundations without presupposing them is philosophically a system that rests in a vacuum. The Islamic doctrine of revelation, examined with the tools that Spinoza has given us, does not survive scrutiny. Not because Islam is singular in its fragility, Judaism and Christianity also do not survive the same scrutiny, but because Islam, of all the Abrahamic traditions, is the one that has most completely built itself upon the assertion of revelational absolutism. The Quran is the direct word of God, infallible in every detail, binding for all humanity for all time. This assertion, confronted with Spinoza's philosophy, has no place to stand. Every attempt to justify it rationally ends in circularity or in an appeal to subjective experience that by definition cannot be communicated or verified by third parties. Which leads us to the question that the Islamic tradition fears the most. If the Quran is not the word of God, what is it? It is a human text. The most influential human text ever produced by an Arab human being, a work of extraordinary spiritual, moral, and literary power, a source of comfort, guidance, identity, and community for over 1 billion people. A cultural achievement unparalleled in the Semitic world, but a human text. With all that this implies, imperfection, historical context, limitations of its author, possibility of critique, possibility of revision, possibility of parts being embraced and others discarded without the world collapsing. Islam cannot admit this, but Spinoza's philosophy demonstrates that not admitting this is what the world needs Islam to learn to do. The Quran under the historical lens, the human marks. That Islam cannot erase it is time to descend from the heights of abstract philosophy and examine the text itself, the Quran, with the eyes of the historian, the philologist, the literary critic, with the eyes that Spinoza used to examine the Hebrew Bible, and that, when applied to the Islamic text, produce exactly the results that Islamic orthodoxy fears. Spinoza was the founder of historical biblical criticism, the method he developed in the theological political treatise, treating sacred texts as historical documents produced by human beings in specific contexts, examining their language, their structure, their internal contradictions, their sources, was subsequently refined and systematized in analyzing the implications of Spinoza's philosophy on the Quran. This scene involves the Prophet Muhammad and a group of his followers. They are gathered in a place where the Prophet is asked to perform a miracle to prove his prophethood. The request is for a sign, something extraordinary that would convince the skeptics of his divine mission. Muhammad responds by stating that he is not a miracle worker and that the Quran itself is the greatest miracle. This moment is significant because it highlights the tension between the expectation of miraculous signs and the emphasis on the Quran as a textual revelation. Spinoza's philosophy challenges the very foundation of the miraculous. He argues that miracles, as traditionally understood, are violations of the natural order and therefore cannot be accepted within a rational framework. For Spinoza, everything that exists operates according to the laws of nature, and any event that appears miraculous must be understood within that context. This perspective leads to the conclusion that the Quran, rather than being a miraculous text, is a product of its historical and cultural circumstances. The implications of this view are profound. If the Quran is not a miraculous revelation, but rather a historical document shaped by human experiences and interactions, then the claims of its eternal and unchanging nature come into question. The Quran's verses, which are often cited as absolute truths, can be seen as reflections of the social, political, and personal contexts in which they were revealed. This understanding does not diminish the significance of the Quran. Instead, it invites a deeper exploration of its meanings and interpretations. Moreover, Spinoza's approach encourages a critical examination of the Quran's content. It opens the door to questioning the interpretations that have been handed down through generations and challenges the notion that there is a single, authoritative understanding of the text. This critical engagement can lead to a richer and more nuanced appreciation of the Quran, one that acknowledges its historical roots while also recognizing its enduring relevance. In conclusion, the intersection of Spinoza's philosophy and the study of the Quran invites a re-evaluation of how we understand religious texts. It emphasizes the importance of context, history, and human agency in the formation of religious beliefs and practices. By recognizing the Quran as a historical document, we can appreciate its complexities and the ways in which it has shaped and been shaped by the cultures in which it has been received. This perspective does not undermine the spiritual significance of the Quran for millions of believers. Rather, it enriches our understanding of its role in the tapestry of human thought and experience. Let us think together about what it implies. It is the year 621 or 622 AD. Muhammad is in Mecca. It is night. According to Islamic tradition, the angel Gabriel appears to Muhammad and leads him to a mythical creature called al-Buraq, a white animal, larger than a donkey and smaller than a mule, that moves with supernatural speed, placing its hooves at the farthest point visible with each step. Mounted on al-Buraq, Muhammad is transported from Mecca to Jerusalem, a distance of approximately 400 kilometers, in a matter of moments or minutes. In Jerusalem, he prays on the Temple Mount alongside all the previous prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, among others. Then he ascends to heaven, crossing 7 celestial levels, meeting a different prophet in each level, contemplating paradise and hell, and finally presenting himself before Allah, who commands him that Muslims should pray 50 times a day. On the way back, Moses, with whom Muhammad met in the 5th or 6th heaven, advises him to negotiate with Allah to reduce the number of daily prayers, as 50 is too much and the faithful will not be able to fulfill it. Muhammad returns before Allah, negotiates, and the number is progressively reduced, 50, 45, 40, and so on, until it reaches 5, the number with which Allah finally agrees after Moses still advises Muhammad to ask for an additional reduction. But Muhammad decides that he does not want to return to Allah anymore. This is the story of Isra wal Mi'raj, the night journey and the ascension. It is one of the most central and beloved narratives in the entire Islamic tradition. Every year, the 17th day of the month of Rajab is celebrated by Muslims as Laylat al-Mi'raj, the night of the ascension. Mosques fill up. Children hear the story for the first time. The narrative is recited in Arabic with a beauty and emotion that deeply moves the believers. Now, with Spinoza's eyes, let us see what this narrative asserts. It asserts that a physical human body was physically transported from Mecca to Jerusalem and back in a single night, violating the laws of physics that govern the movement of bodies in space. It asserts that this same body crossed 7 layers of the physical universe and entered a supernatural realm. It asserts that Allah, the infinite, eternal, absolutely transcendent being, whom Islamic doctrines themselves describe as incomparably beyond any human understanding, had a negotiation with Muhammad about a number, as if he were a merchant in a bazaar, and that in this negotiation Moses' argument, "Go back and ask for less," was sufficiently convincing to modify the will of the Lord of the universe. Spinoza dedicated chapter 6 of the theological political treatise to the question of miracles, and his argumentation in that chapter is of such clarity and strength that it still remains without a satisfactory philosophical response from any religious tradition that claims to respect reason. Spinoza's central argument is as follows. A miracle is, by definition, an event that violates the laws of nature. But the laws of nature are the expression of God's nature. They are the way God necessarily acts, by necessity of his own essence. Therefore, a miracle would be God acting contrary to his own essence, which is a logical contradiction. God cannot do something that contradicts his own nature, for the same reason that a circle cannot be square, not because God is powerless, but because the proposition is incoherent. The theologians who assert that God can suspend the natural laws whenever he wants are in fact asserting that God does not have a stable and necessary nature, that God acts arbitrarily, that the universe could be completely different if God so desired, but that is not omnipotence. It is arbitrariness. And an arbitrary God is not the foundation of any truth, because if God can suspend any law at any moment, there is no law, there is no order, there is no truth, there is only the whim of an unpredictable will. Spinoza goes further. He observes that the belief in miracles is fundamentally incompatible with the belief in divine providence. If God acts by providence, by an intelligent and constant order that governs the universe, then the universe is regulated by stable laws that express that providence. Suspending those laws would disorder providence. It would be God contradicting God. The defenders of miracles respond that God can intervene without contradicting his providence, that miracles are foreseen in divine providence from eternity, that they are part of the plan, not deviations from the plan. Spinoza would respond, if miracles are part of the plan from eternity, then they obey laws, the laws of the plan, and if they obey laws, they are not technically miracles. They are natural events whose laws we do not yet understand, which is exactly what Spinoza said all miracles are. But the most practical dimension of Spinoza's argument about miracles has to do with epistemology, with how we can know what happened. How do we know that Isra wal Mi'raj happened? We know because it is in the Quran. The direct reference is Surah 17:1. Glory be to him who transported his servant by night, and because it is extensively narrated in the hadiths. But how do we know that the hadiths are reliable? The hadiths, the collections of sayings and actions attributed to Muhammad, were compiled 1 to 2 centuries after the Prophet's death. Islamic hadith science developed sophisticated criteria to assess the authenticity of the chains of transmission, isnad. Who transmitted the hadith, who received it from whom, the moral reputation and memory of each link in the chain. The collections considered most reliable, Bukhari and Muslim, both from the 9th century, are revered by Sunnis as almost as authoritative as the Quran. But the epistemological problem is irreparable. An oral chain of transmission that goes back 1 or 2 centuries, passing through dozens of transmitters whose moral character was retrospectively evaluated by the hadith compilers themselves, is not a form of historical evidence that would withstand the scrutiny of modern historical methods, especially when what is being transmitted includes accounts of physically impossible events. Spinoza would have said, the strength of a historical testimony can never be so great as to make probable an event that contradicts the invariable laws of nature. If someone tells me they saw a man resurrect, the most likely explanation is that the testimony is wrong, or that the observer was mistaken, or that the event was misinterpreted, not that the laws of physics were suspended. The probability that the laws of physics were suspended is so infinitesimally small that no amount of testimony could raise it to the level of rational belief. And here lies the cruel paradox at the center of Islamic theology regarding miracles. The Quran itself, in multiple passages, responds to the demands of the unbelievers for miracles by saying that Muhammad's only miracle is the Quran itself. Why did he not bring us a sign from his Lord? Ask the unbelievers, and the divine response repeatedly is, the Quran is the sign. This is extraordinarily significant. The sacred text itself seems to distrust physical miracles as evidence of prophecy. It seems to prefer the intellectual and spiritual evidence of the text over the evidence of physical prodigy, which, interestingly, is closer to the Spinozist position than to the later popular Islamic theology, which proliferated physical miracles of Muhammad in increasing number and variety over the centuries. But if Muhammad's only miracle is the Quran, and if the Quran is evidence of itself, as we argued in the previous block, then the evidence is circular, and the entire edifice rests on nothing more solid than the subjective conviction of the believers, which is, for Spinoza, exactly where it has always been. Religious belief rests on imagination and emotion, not on reason, and this is not necessarily bad. It has its function, its value, its beauty. But to claim that it is rational evidence of objective truth is a confusion between two completely different domains that, when not clarified, produces exactly the kind of intolerance, violence, and suppression of freedom that the history of Islam and of all Abrahamic religions abundantly demonstrates. Muhammad, power, and the sword, what Islamic sources say that the faithful prefer not to hear. There is an honest way and a dishonest way to ask the question I am about to ask now. The dishonest way is to ask it with disdain, with the aim of demolishing rather than understanding. The honest way is to ask it with the same rigor, the same seriousness, and the same respect for evidence that we would apply to any other historical figure of comparable importance and influence. The question is, how did Muhammad deal with dissent? With those who criticized him? With those who... They were satirized. By those who doubted his prophecy, by those who, having converted to Islam, later left the faith, by the tribes and communities that refused to recognize his authority. Asking this question is not Islamophobia. It is history. It is the same type of question we ask about Constantine, about Charlemagne, about any founder of civilization who wielded power. And the Islamic sources, the Sirahs, the Hadiths, the collections of early Islamic history, answer this question with a candor that, when read carefully, is deeply disturbing to those who seek evidence of divine prophecy rather than human politics. Let us begin with the poets. In pre-Islamic Arabia, poetry was a form of political power. Poets who satirized a leader, who mocked their failures, who demoralized their followers through verse were political agents of considerable force. Muhammad understood this. He had his own poets like Hassan ibn Thabit, who composed verses in defense of Islam, and he reacted to opposing poets with a combination of responses that the Islamic sources document without evasion. Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf was a Jewish poet from Medina, the son of an Arab father and a Jewish mother, who composed elegies lamenting the Quraysh dead in the Battle of Badr and satirical poems against Muhammad. The Islamic sources record that Muhammad asked his followers, "Who will rid me of Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf?" Muhammad ibn Maslama volunteered. With the explicit permission of the Prophet, he set a trap, lured Ka'b at night under the pretext of a friendly visit, and killed him. Asma bint Marwan was an Arab poetess who composed verses criticizing the tribes that had accepted Muhammad as a leader after the assassination of Ka'b. Umayr ibn Adi, a follower of Muhammad who was blind in one eye, went to her house at night, removed the baby she was nursing from her breast, and killed her while she slept. When reporting the act to the Prophet, Muhammad approved it. Two goats will not butt heads because of her. Abu Afaq was a 90-year-old elder who had composed verses criticizing Muhammad. Salim ibn Umayr killed him while he slept. When someone expressed horror at the murder of such an old elder, Muhammad did not express disapproval. These episodes are documented in respected Islamic sources, in the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, in the work of Ibn Ishaq, in the Hadiths. They are not inventions of the enemies of Islam. They are part of the record that the tradition itself preserved. Spinoza, who was expelled from his community for thinking freely but never faced physical threat for it, would have recognized in this documentation the political logic he described in the theological political treatise. When the authority of a leader is fused with the authority of God, the critics of the leader are not merely political adversaries, they are blasphemers, and blasphemy, especially the blasphemy that threatens the cohesion of the political community, can legitimately be punished with death, not out of cruelty but out of political necessity disguised as divine imperative. Now let us move on to the more numerically devastating cases. The treatment of the Jewish tribes of Medina. When Muhammad arrived in Medina in 622, there were three main Jewish tribes in the city: Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. Islamic sources and modern historians generally agree that the relationship between Muhammad and these tribes began relatively peacefully. The document known as the Constitution of Medina recognized the Jews as members of the community, with certain rights and obligations. The relationship progressively deteriorated over the following years. In 624, after the Battle of Badr, Muhammad expelled the Banu Qaynuqa from Medina. In 625, after the Battle of Uhud, he expelled the Banu Nadir, whose property was confiscated and distributed among the Muslims. In 627, during the siege of Medina, when a coalition army unsuccessfully attempted to take the city, the Banu Qurayza were accused of treason. After the siege, all the adult men of the tribe were executed. The women and children were enslaved. Their property was divided among the Muslims. Islamic sources record that the sentence was pronounced by Sa'd ibn Mu'ad, an Arab chief whom Muhammad had appointed as arbitrator. When the sentence was announced, Muhammad said it was the sentence of Allah above the seven heavens. The number of men executed is disputed. Islamic sources speak of 600 to 900, while a more conservative modern estimate suggests 200 to 400. What was the accusation of treason? According to Islamic sources, the Banu Qurayza contacted the besiegers and negotiated an alliance. The historical evidence is, by modern standards, circumstantial and partially based on testimonies from rival tribes. But in the context of the siege of Medina, when the very survival of the Muslim community seemed at risk, Muhammad made the decision to eliminate a potential source of internal threat. Spinoza would not need to make moral judgments about these events, although the moral implications are obviously grave. What he would observe is the structure. Muhammad's actions were sanctioned by divine revelations. The expulsion of the Banu Nadir was preceded and accompanied by verses from the Quran that presented it as an act of God punishing a people who had corrupted the scriptures. The execution of the Banu Qurayza was declared the judgment of Allah by Muhammad. Theology and politics were, once again, indistinguishable. And here is the Spinozist argument that is most troubling. If Muhammad was merely a human being, extraordinarily capable, genuinely charismatic, of enormous historical impact, but human, then his political decisions were exactly that. Political decisions, made under extreme pressure, with limited information, with the prejudices and values of a 7th century Arab, with goals that included the survival and expansion of his community, decisions that a historian can examine, contextualize, criticize, and sometimes defend based on their historical outcomes. Decisions that no human being in the 21st century is obliged to follow as an eternal model of behavior. But if Muhammad was the messenger of God, if his decisions were sanctioned by divine revelations, then these decisions are not just history, they are eternal law. They are the model that Muslims of all times are urged to follow. They are the Sunnah, the way of the Prophet, which classical Islamic law considers binding as a source of jurisprudence. This is the consequence that Spinoza did not explicitly formulate about Islam, because he was primarily speaking about Judaism, but that the logic of his philosophy makes inevitable. When the political decision of a 7th century human being is frozen in the form of an eternal commandment of God, a system is produced that cannot learn, that cannot grow, that cannot respond adaptively to the moral changes that humanity experiences over the centuries. A system that, in its most rigorous versions, still today executes apostates, amputates the hands of thieves, stones adulterers, prohibits women from leaving home without a male companion. Not because those who practice these things are necessarily cruel, but because these are the laws of God as conveyed by Muhammad, and changing the laws of God is apostasy. Spinoza saw this mechanism in Mosaic law. But he was honest enough to recognize that there was a crucial difference. Judaism, after centuries of diaspora and contact with other philosophical traditions, had developed a capacity for flexible reinterpretation. The Talmud, the rabbinic tradition, the responsa, that allowed the law to adapt without formally abandoning it. Islam, in its most rigorous currents, has resisted this adaptation, and the cost of this resistance is what we are seeing around the world: the law of apostasy. When philosophy becomes a death sentence, there is a point in the conversation about Spinoza and Islam where abstract philosophy suddenly becomes viscerally concrete, where we stop talking about concepts and start talking about lives, about bodies, about what happens in the real world to flesh and blood human beings who do exactly what Spinoza did, who examine the foundations of their faith and reach conclusions different from those prescribed by religious authority. That point is the Islamic law on apostasy. Ridda, apostasy, the abandonment of Islam by a Muslim, is, in classical Islamic law, a crime punishable by death. Not in all interpretations, not in all Islamic legal systems, and not in all countries with a Muslim majority, but in the dominant opinion of the four Sunni legal schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, and in the Shia school, an adult Muslim who leaves Islam and does not repent must be killed. This is not a marginal, extremist, or historically atypical opinion. It is the position of jurists who rank among the most respected in the classical Islamic tradition. Ibn Qudama, the great Hanbali jurist of the 12th century, was clear. The apostate must be invited to repent for 3 days. If he repents, he is freed. If not, he is killed. Malik ibn Anas, the founder of the Maliki school, was even more succinct. The apostate must be killed immediately. The basis for this law is hadiths attributed to Muhammad, the most famous one, transmitted in Bukhari. The most respected collection of hadiths in Sunni Islam is brutally concise. Man badala dinahu faqtuluhu. Whoever changes his religion, kill him. 5 words in Arabic, 6 centuries of deaths. Spinoza was expelled from his community for questioning the foundations of his faith, but he was never threatened with death. The expulsion was painful, socially and existentially, but he could walk the streets of Amsterdam, visit bookstores, converse with Christian thinkers, correspond with the best intellectuals in Europe. He could ultimately simply not be Jewish and just be Benedictus de Spinoza, lens polisher, philosopher, citizen of a reasonably tolerant republic. For the Muslim who reads Spinoza and agrees with him, for the Muslim who examines the Quran with the eyes of critical reason and concludes that it is a human text, or who questions Muhammad's prophecy, or who simply stops believing in God, the situation is fundamentally different. In dozens of countries, it is not a matter of social expulsion, it is a matter of physical survival. The numbers are documentable and disturbing. In Afghanistan, under any government that applies Sharia, and this includes the Taliban, but is not limited to it, apostasy is punishable by death. In Iran, although there is no penal code that explicitly codifies the death penalty for apostasy, judges can and do apply classical Islamic law, and apostasy can result in execution, especially when combined with charges of insulting the Prophet. In Mauritania, the penal law codifies the death penalty for apostasy. In Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, the legal system allows apostasy to be treated as a crime. In Pakistan, although apostasy itself is not codified as a capital crime, the blasphemy law, which is widely used against those who question Islam, provides for the death penalty. In countries where there is no formal law on apostasy, the threat comes from society. Families that kill their members who abandon the faith, communities that act as informal judges and executioners. The phenomenon of so-called religious honor crimes, which disproportionately affect women but also men, is documented in countries like Jordan, Egypt, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. And in the West, among immigrant Muslim communities, the social pressure, family rupture, and ostracism that accompany leaving Islam are severe enough that many ex-Muslims live their new convictions in secret, sometimes for years or decades, without anyone close knowing. Spinoza accurately identified, in the theological political treatise, why systems like this are incompatible with a just civil order and human dignity. The argument is at two levels. At the philosophical level, belief cannot be coerced. It is impossible from a psychological and philosophical standpoint to force someone to believe in something under the threat of punishment. What the threat can do is force the person to assert belief, to utter words, to perform rituals, to maintain an appearance of faith. But genuine belief is an internal state of mind that does not obey orders and is not modified by swords. A state that tries to control the beliefs of its citizens by force is not producing genuine believers. It is producing hypocrites who are afraid. And a system that produces mass hypocrites is not serving God. It is serving the power of those who control the system. At the political level, Spinoza argued that the state has legitimate authority over the actions of citizens, but not over their thoughts and beliefs. The social contract that founds the state is about regulating external behavior, what people do, not about regulating internal conscience, what people think and believe. Trying to regulate conscience through state power is, for Spinoza, the deepest form of tyranny. Not the tyranny of the body, but the tyranny of the mind. Islamic law on apostasy is precisely that, the attempt to use the power of the state and of the community and of the family to regulate what human beings believe about ultimate issues, to forcibly maintain the confessional uniformity that the power system requires to function. Because, and here we return to the argument about religion as a political instrument, a Muslim who leaves Islam is not just changing his private belief. He is, in the context of societies where Islam is the state religion, withdrawing his loyalty from the power system that legitimizes itself through Islam. He is becoming a dissident, not only religiously, but politically. And that is why apostasy is punished as treason, because functionally, it is treason against the theocratic state. Spinoza saw exactly this mechanism in the case of Jesus. Jesus was executed not because his religious opinions were intolerable to the Jewish leaders in purely theological terms, but because his actions and teachings were seen as a threat to the political order that the priestly leaders of Jerusalem had built in collaboration with Rome. Theology was the pretext. Power was the reason. Similarly, Islamic law on apostasy is not primarily a matter of theology, of protecting God's truth against those who reject it. It is primarily a matter of power, of maintaining the cohesion of a system that confuses God's authority with the authority of those who govern in God's name. And it is here that Spinoza's philosophy reaches its most urgent, contemporary, and necessary point. Today there are millions of ex-Muslims in the world, people who were raised in Islam, who lived it genuinely, and who, at some point in their lives, did what Spinoza did. They examined the foundations of their faith with intellectual honesty and reached conclusions that separated them from it. Some have come to atheism, others to agnosticism, others to a non-confessional spirituality, others simply to the conclusion that Islam, as a legal and political system, is no longer compatible with the values they have discovered to be their own. Most of them live in silence. Many use pseudonyms online. Some, those who have the courage or the need to speak publicly, live under security protection or in undisclosed locations. Ayaan Hirsi Ali left Islam, became a member of the Dutch Parliament, and collaborated with filmmaker Theo van Gogh on the film Submission about the oppression of women in Islam. Van Gogh was murdered in November 2004 by Mohamed Bouyeri, a Moroccan-Dutch Islamist who left a letter on his body threatening Hirsi Ali. She has lived under security protection since then. Salman Rushdie published The Satanic Verses in 1988. Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa declaring that Rushdie deserved to be killed for blasphemy. In August 2022, Hadi Matar climbed onto the stage where Rushdie was speaking at a literary event in New York State and repeatedly stabbed him. Rushdie lost the sight in one eye and the use of one hand. Ibn Warraq, the pseudonym of an ex-Muslim who preferred not to reveal his name for obvious reasons, published in 1995 Why I Am Not a Muslim, one of the most comprehensive and rigorous critiques of Islam ever written. He lives under a protected identity. Spinoza, upon being excommunicated, said, according to accounts from his contemporaries, that the banishment troubled him less than expected, as he had already decided that he would do nothing that reason prohibited him from doing. It was a declaration of absolute intellectual independence, formulated with the calm of someone who had already reached his conclusions and did not need anyone's approval to maintain them. The ex-Muslims of the 21st century, those living in Islamic countries, those living in Islamic communities in the West, those trying to think freely within or outside of Islam, would need a fraction of the courage that Spinoza demonstrated at that moment. But for them, unlike Spinoza, the courage comes at a price that goes beyond social ostracism. For them, the price may be life. And that is why the question that Spinoza taught us to ask: what is a prophet? Where do sacred texts come from? Can the Quran be examined like any other historical document? Is not just an academic question. It is a political question. It is a moral question. It is a question about what kind of world we want to build and what kind of freedom we believe human beings deserve. Spinoza answered that question with his life, with his work, with his voluntary exile, and his refusal to bend. The question remains unanswered definitively, and it is being answered now in real time by men and women who have never heard the name Spinoza, but who are doing in their lives exactly what he did in yours, thinking freely at any cost. What Spinoza discovered about Muhammad, that no Muslim dares to debate God sive natura versus Allah, an incompatibility without exit. The God of Spinoza and the Allah of Islam are not different versions of the same idea. They are contradictory assertions about the nature of reality. And only one can be right. The Islamic Allah is a personal being. He thinks, wills, decides, speaks, creates, and intervenes. He existed before the universe and could have created a different universe if he wished. He sends messengers, reveals books, hears prayers, forgives, and punishes. The God of Spinoza is the infinite and necessary substance of all reality. He did not create the universe. He is the universe. He does not act by will. He acts out of necessity of his own nature. Just as the sun does not decide to emit light, he has no emotions, no preferences, does not intervene, does not speak. To say that these two conceptions are the same God seen from different angles is intellectually dishonest. Allah is a subject. The Spinozist God is the substance of which all subjects are modifications. A subject cannot be identical to the substance that contains it. The consequence is direct. The God capable of revealing the Quran simply does not exist in the universe that Spinoza describes. And the universe that Spinoza describes is what modern physics, biology, and cosmology have found. Einstein explicitly stated that he believed in the God of Spinoza, not in the God of revealed religions. This is not definitive proof that Allah does not exist, but it irretrievably shifts the burden of proof. Islam claims something extraordinary, that an infinite being dictated a book in Arabic to a man in the 7th century. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the available evidence points in the opposite direction. The Spinozas of Islam, those who tried and those who paid Islam, is not a monolith impervious to questioning. Over 14 centuries, there have been thinkers within the Islamic tradition who reached conclusions close to Spinoza's. All paid a high price for it. Al-Ma'ari, an Arab poet of the 11th century, claimed that the prophets were fabulists and that the Quran was no better than other literary works. He lived as a recluse and died of old age, one of the rare cases of luck among Islamic freethinkers. Ibn Rushd, the Averroes of the 12th century, argued that philosophy should prevail over revelation when there is conflict between them, and that the Quran contains philosophical truths expressed in allegorical language for the masses. His books were burned. He ended up in exile. His writings survived not in the Islamic world, but in Christian Europe, where they became the foundation of Renaissance thought and, indirectly, of Spinoza. Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, an Egyptian scholar of the 20th century, applied the historical critical hermeneutics that Spinoza had inaugurated for the Bible to the Quran. He was declared an apostate by an Egyptian court in 1995. His marriage was dissolved by force of law. He fled to the Netherlands, the country of Spinoza, where he taught until his death in 2010. The pattern is invariant. Every Islamic thinker who reached the conclusion that the Quran is a historically situated text has been persecuted, exiled, or killed. Islam produced its Spinozas. It simply did not allow them to live among their own. The deepest irony: all these reformers developed their ideas in dialogue with the philosophical tradition that Spinoza inaugurated. The biblical criticism he founded returned to the Islamic world as a tool for analyzing the Quran. Spinoza, expelled by Jews in Amsterdam, became the philosophical ancestor of the most persecuted intellectuals of modern Islam. The glass ceiling of academia, the censorship that no one admits. In contemporary Western academia, there is a double standard that scholars themselves rarely admit publicly, but that any researcher in the field recognizes. The critical study of Islam operates with a caution that does not exist for Judaism or Christianity. A scholar who claims that the Pentateuch was written by multiple human authors does not risk his life. A scholar who argues that the Gospels reflect the disputes of the early Christian communities can publish with any university press in the world. No one comes to his house at night. The situation for scholars who make the equivalent claim about the Quran is different. Gerd Rudiger Puyn, who analyzed the ancient Quranic manuscripts discovered in Sana'a in 1972, stated that what he saw would shake Islam. Access to the manuscripts was cut off due to political and religious pressure. Patricia Crone, who applied modern historical criticism to early Islam, received death threats for decades. The result is that there are questions that any biblical scholar asks in the first week of graduate school. What is the history of the composition of this text? What are its human sources? That in Quranic studies still require a disproportionate dose of courage. Spinoza wrote the theological political treatise to defend exactly what is being suppressed here: the right to examine any sacred text with the same methods that apply to any other historical document. The self-censorship produced by fear is the most effective form of censorship, because it needs no decree, no police. It needs nothing but the silent knowledge of what happens to those who go too far. Spinoza would say, the truth does not need protection. Only what fears examination needs to be shielded from questions: the responses of Islam and why they are not enough. Philosophical honesty requires that we present the Islamic arguments against Spinoza seriously. Islam has real answers. They simply are not sufficient. First argument: human reason is limited. Why trust that a faculty developed for survival purposes can reach ultimate truths? Spinoza would respond, I agree that reason is limited, but appealing to revelation as an alternative does not solve the problem. It creates another. Any criterion for recognizing an authentic revelation will inevitably be rational. Revelation does not escape reason. It depends on it to be recognized as such. Second argument: the extraordinary expansion of Islam in less than a century is evidence of a supernatural force. Spinoza would respond, the historical success of a movement is not evidence of its truth. Alexander the Great created an even larger empire even faster, without divine revelation. Political success has sufficient historical explanations. Third argument: the literary inimitability of the Quran proves its divine origin. Spinoza would respond, circular argument. The Quran seems inimitable primarily to those who grew up within the Islamic tradition, where the text has resonance accumulated over a lifetime of exposure. Extraordinary texts exist in every cultural tradition. None is divine simply for being extraordinary. Fourth argument: Islam produced a remarkable civilization in the 8th to 13th centuries. Spinoza would respond, I fully agree. And that is exactly what religions do when they function well. They create cohesion, stimulate knowledge, organize communities. But historical efficacy is not evidence of eternal truth. The same Islam that produced Avicenna also produced, centuries later, the burning of Avicenna's books. Ultimately, all these arguments work only from within the system. For those who already believe, they are convincing. For those who examine without the presupposition of faith, they are circular. And an argument that only convinces those who are already convinced is not an argument. It is a confirmation. In the absence of arguments that work outside the circle of believers, the threat of violence continues to operate as a philosophical substitute. The Islam that can still be. The philosophy of Spinoza has functioned, throughout this video, as a tool of demolition. But demolition is not the final goal. The goal is honesty. And honesty requires recognizing that within Islam there is much that would survive, and that needs to survive, a Spinozist reform. The radical monotheism of Islam, the insistence that God is one, indivisible, incomparable, irreducible to any image, has a philosophical strength that Spinoza would have recognized. The ethics of equality before God, regardless of race, class, or origin, was genuinely revolutionary in the Arab context of the 7th century. The call to reflection and knowledge that runs through the Quran, "Read in the name of your Lord," could be the foundation of an intellectual tradition that embraces the very historical critique of the sacred text. What Spinoza would ask of Islam is not its destruction, it is its philosophical maturity. The willingness to look at the Quran as an extraordinary text produced by an extraordinary human being, and to separate with honesty and care the ethical and spiritual core that transcends time from the historical contingencies that surround it and that no longer need to govern the present. This work is already being done by Islamic feminists who reinterpret verses about women, by jurists who argue that Islamic law has always been interpreted and that the question is which hermeneutics to use, by theologians who distinguish between the eternal spirit of the message and its contingent historical expressions. All of them are, consciously or not, following the method that Spinoza inaugurated. Protestantism transformed Catholicism. Haskalah transformed Orthodox Judaism. The Islam will need to make an analogous movement, not because the West demands it, but because the assertion of eternal absolutism and the reality of a world in constant transformation can only coexist through force or reform. And force, as history repeatedly demonstrates, never solves the problem. It merely postpones it. What remains? Conclusion: we have reached the end. And the end demands clarity. What Spinoza discovered about Muhammad was not a hidden secret. It was the result of applying to Islam the same standard of critical reason that he applied to the Bible, and that, since then, modernity applies to everything. When applied to Islam, this reason produces 4 conclusions that stand independently of one another. The God capable of revealing the Quran does not exist in the universe that modern philosophy and science describe. The Quran bears unmistakable marks of human origin, documented by the Islamic sources themselves. Muhammad was an extraordinary human being, but human with the limitations and interests of a 7th century Arab political leader. And the system that Islam built on these premises is incompatible with genuine human freedom. These conclusions are not an invitation to hatred or contempt for Muslims. The overwhelming majority of Muslims live their faith as a source of meaning, community, and spiritual beauty. Criticizing the philosophical foundations of Islam is not attacking the people who live within it. It is precisely the respect that Spinoza demonstrated by treating any system of ideas with maximum intellectual honesty, rather than sparing it out of condescension. Spinoza was expelled, impoverished, and died at the age of 44 with his books banned. Decades after his death, being called a Spinozist was still an insult. Today he is one of the most read philosophers in Western history. The ideas that caused horror became the philosophical substrate of modernity, the separation between church and state, freedom of conscience, the historical criticism of sacred texts. Ideas that are sufficiently true survive persecution. They always have. And Spinoza's central idea that the human being who honestly examines the foundations of their beliefs, who does not accept the sword as a philosophical argument, who thinks with their own reason as far as it takes them, is sufficiently true to survive everything, including the silence of those who would prefer this conversation had never happened. But it did happen. And now you know what Spinoza discovered about Muhammad that no Muslim dares to debate.